G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today we are looking at my team selection for the Brazilian Grand Prix this coming weekend. So if you're new around here and enjoying the content, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Now, unfortunately, I won't have time to record another video before the deadline. My usual race week preview and final thoughts goes out about Wednesday, Thursday, but for those of you that are clued into F1 Fantasy this week, there has been a little bit of a delay with finalizing scores for this week. And by the time this video comes out, it's going to be Wednesday anyway. So it probably doesn't really make much sense to record another video, which I'll essentially be covering all of that contents for in this one as well. Before we jump into everything Brazil Grand Prix related, let's just quickly jump into how things shook out in Mexico. And before I get into the scores, as I just mentioned, F1 did, have a delay with finalizing scores for this week. The reason that was because Alex Albon and Yuki Tsunoda had, I think it was 10 to 20 overtakes assigned to each of them on that first turn by accident. And it took some time for F1 to finalize the scores for those two drivers. And there were slight tweaks to several other drivers as well. For example, Valtteri Bottas was previously 3, but was readjusted to have 2 points scored over the weekend. And I know the McLaren constructor and several other assets in the game also received very small adjustments to their overtake scores for the weekend. But now, at the time of recording, the game has reopened ahead of Brazil, so you've still got a few days left to tinker with your lineups and map out a plan of attack for Interlagos. So 252 points was my score from the weekend. My rank, again, even with the Carlos Sainz breakthrough, which we'll talk about in just a second, didn't really go anywhere because of the Albon DNF. Anyone that was able to avoid him, I'm sure, saw a green arrow from the weekend. But I think the story of the weekend was undoubtedly the performance of the Ferrari. Carlos Sainz coming away with 47 points, his season high, outstripping even his 46 in Australia. So I have to say, a truly commendable result for him. He's gone the last 2 weeks with 40 plus points performances, and Ferrari have been 1-2 in fantasy points the last 2 weeks. Obviously, they had a 1-2 in Austin and a 1-3 in Mexico, but in terms of pure fantasy scores, both Sainz and Leclerc are 1-2 in back-to-back weeks, and it goes to show that maybe not changing all that much with the car can actually do wonders when you know the package that you're dealing with. So a great result for him, a $1 million increase, and finally the patience of holding this pretty much identical lineup for the last 5 weeks in a row with almost no trades since I activated wildcard in Monza strategically has paid off. And I say that strategically in the sense that I haven't really had the budget to go up to a Leclerc or a Piastri, and I'm aiming for that 3X DRS boost chip in Qatar with hopefully just enough value to squeeze out of that. So we will also talk about the way forward for angling for the 3X in Qatar. But a solid result. Again, the rank's certainly not pretty. I've been pretty honest about that throughout the season. So the 3K, my best point throughout the season, is certainly out of reach. I think anything inside the top 10K would be nice, but hoping to make a few breakthroughs with the 3X in Qatar. Aside from Carlos, Lando, he's proving to be reliable in fantasy, even if his results on track are not giving him the opportunity to push Max for the World Drivers' Championship. I do think it's very much out of his reach now. I don't see him clawing back that deficit with only 4 races left. But in terms of a fantasy asset, and a consistently good one at that, I don't think he's going anywhere in my team. Another person who's not moving is Franco Colapinto, 8 points. His fifth price rise in a row. We haven't seen a C-tier asset go up 0.5 million in 5 consecutive races since Kevin Magnussen did that between Austria and Monza of this season. So it is a truly commendable, streak that Franco is on at the moment. He's overshadowed his teammate Alex Albon, who in that 5-race span since he joined the grid has only seen 2 $0.5 million increases. And Alex Albon, another driver that I think has had his moments this season, But another DNF, his 5th this season, leading all drivers. And funnily enough, the other driver he got tangled up with, Yuki Tsunoda, is 2nd overall with all drivers with 4. So not a great result for Alex Albon. Another price drop, much like his teammate in my fantasy team, Valtteri Bottas. So not a pretty sight for Alex Albon and Valtteri, but I think with Valtteri, you've kind of got to expect those price decreases week in, week out. So that's just, I think, the product of having slightly lower budget. If you're able to afford the Tsunodas or the Lawsons or the Hulkenbergs or whatever it might be, then I think you're in a slightly better position than I am. I do want to move into some insights for Interlagos, some very particular ones to this track and the kind of chips in play for this weekend. And the reason I say that is because of the fact that it is going to be another weekend where we do see a lot of fantasy managers activate their, let's call it, risk mitigation chips, the no negative, the autopilot, the final fix. And I do think that with the retirement history, although not by any means as bad as some of the other tracks on the calendar, does come with DNFs regardless. We saw 6 retirements here last year. Charles Leclerc couldn't even make it to the start line. And then we did see on that opening turn, I believe it was Alex Albon and Kevin Magnussen came together there. K-Mag actually hasn't had a great track record at Interlagos. We know he did an exceptional lap. And although maybe the elements played into his favor to secure pole in 2022, didn't finish the race there. And then obviously came to blows with Alex Albon last season as well. So not a great track record for the Dane at Brazil, but I do think that, maybe he is someone that's turning a corner this season in F1 fantasy at least. I do think he's got the minerals and the merit in F1 fantasy with those overtakes and with that really competitive race pace that the Haas has right now to really make an impact. Certainly at a track like Brazil where there are several overtakes on the cards for drivers in the midfield. So I really like the look of K-Mag as a result of that. But I do think we throw in the sprint race weekend, that extra session of risk for DNFs. You throw in the fact that there's going to be rain throughout the weekend. We know Brazil does get a lot of rain most years. And I think, the perfect storm of those two things, there's several managers that probably have their negative and autopilot. I think those are chips also suited to a sprint race weekend. So I think it's a really nice track to kind of dovetail those chips into Brazil. And for those of you with Limitless or 3X left, I'd be saving those for Qatar. More overtakes on the table there. Dry racing conditions, as we know, and it will be pushed further back into the calendar than it was 12 months ago, where we were driving in extreme weather conditions in terms of the heat and what the drivers had to deal with there. So I do think Interlagos, it's one of my favorite tracks to watch races at on TV. Never been there, but I do think it's going to be, again, another really interesting race for a lot of drivers and a lot at stake given it's a sprint race weekend. I think on the overtakes, just quickly, although very mixed in terms of how the overtakes stack up between last year and the year prior to that, 70-ish seems about right for this track, and I'd probably expect that's going to be the same again this time. That's about 3.5 overtakes per driver, obviously a few more for the drivers in the midfield. So I think if you are eyeing off the likes of someone like K-Mag, Nico Hulkenberg, Liam Lawson, Yuki Tsunoda, and even the Alpines, although maybe not the most competitive car, seem to have, in fantasy terms, at least squeezed a couple of price increases out of their drivers recently. The upgrades, I'm not suggesting Alpine are back in the top half of the grid, but they are seemingly on paper at least competitive. So maybe another couple of drivers to entertain this weekend. Max Verstappen, there's speculation of a 5-place grid penalty or maybe even more than that heading into Brazil. We saw in free practice last week in Mexico, he was really struggling with the car. It seemed to have a number of issues that prompted in FP2 his return to the pits. So I do suspect if they aren't willing to run the old engine, which they did have in Mexico, they may take a 5 or a 10-place grid penalty for Max to essentially try and get himself back into the fight. We've seen drivers like Lewis Hamilton drive really well in years past, coming from all the way back into the top 10, top 5 with 10 or 20 place grid penalties. So I wouldn't be surprised at an overtake track that Max Verstappen takes another grid penalty. in addition to the one he took in Spa. And I think the other thing I did want to cover off just quickly, I love that it's becoming more of a theme with each passing week, is the Elite Data Insights from F1 Fantasy Tools. Now, I'm not going to spend as much time as I did maybe on it last week, but I do think there is some interesting insights to obviously think about coming into this weekend with the no negative and the autopilot chips on the table. I've talked about why I like Global 500 and Patreon 500 equally, but I know a number of you wanted to see the Global 500 insights in some of the videos moving forward. And if we do go down to the no negative on the right-hand side here, just under 20% of people still have the no negative available to use. I do think most will probably activate it at Brazil for the reasons mentioned. And I think autopilot, again, another chip to protect that 2x driver on the weekend to avoid any kind of risk. I mean, Lando, Oscar, Charles, they've all proven to be very reliable drivers lately. I don't see that changing anytime soon, but it is obviously nice to have that protective mechanism on a driver that you'd think is going to be good, but obviously want to avoid any kind of risk like that. And we've seen over the years, over the races so far, that even though Canada was a wet race, Imola was dry. Interesting to see autopilot used there, but not often do we see sprint races really draw the attention of the autopilot chip, even though it is a high scoring weekend. So you obviously want to maximize the ceiling of points for your 2x driver. But we did see quite a number of people use it at Circuit of the Americas, a sprint race weekend most recently. Wouldn't be surprised if we see something like that happen again. But it is interesting to see, the 3X chip, still 40% yet to use in the top 500. I think we might see some in Brazil, but I do suspect Qatar is going to be where we see the real momentum shift for that powerful chip with a couple races left. Almost no one left to use Limitless. Again, wouldn't be using it at Brazil with that rain hazard, given that it's just another variable you don't want to have to consider with such a powerful chip. And then final fix, you saw quite a number of people use that with the Piastri grid penalty. Not grid penalty, the out of position qualifying result for Oscar in Mexico. So if anything like that happens, much like in Mexico, Baku, we could see something like that pop up again. So yeah, where does that essentially leave us for the run into team selection and DRS boost choices for the weekend? I think quickly taking a look at the power rankings, I've got Max, although not by any means an incredible result in Mexico, in all honesty, quite disappointing with his, I would consider it dirty driving to an extent. But I put stock in him for Brazil because of that grid place penalty we've just talked about. So keep an eye on that. And if you've got the budget to bring in Max and another premium driver like Carlos Sainz, I really like that combination. I know Max didn't have a great weekend in Mexico, but Sainz and Verstappen, the most expensive driver and one of the more reliable, the most reliable and high-performing BT drivers in Carlos Sainz. I really like that as a nice 1-2 punch if you have the budget to stretch with Ferrari and McLaren as your constructors. Sainz, stock flying, and understandably so, a great result for him. And I do think that's going to continue heading into the rest of the season. And then in the C tier, Hülkenberg, I really like him. An experienced driver coming to a track where there is, again, some degree of risk. And I think you want to have some of those more experienced drivers in your team for this weekend, in the wet weather, potentially sprint races. The stakes are going to be much higher than usual. Hulk's coming off the back of a 9-point performance in Mexico, and he's only had one score below 6 even in the last 6 races. So he's gone 9 in Mexico and then 11, 6, 6, -3, and then 6. So I'm really liking that figure of consistency you're seeing from Nico Hülkenberg. Another driver that's probably been overlooked just a little bit at the moment is Esteban Ocon. I mean, you could say this for perhaps the Alpine duo, but I'm going to focus on Ocon specifically. Much like Hülkenberg has had a really nice string of results. He's scored above 3. I know 3 isn't by any means a nice benchmark, but if we put scores of 3 or 4, the 3 in Netherlands and the 4 in Monza aside, he's scored above 6 in every race since Silverstone. So really liking that consistency with Ocon. I believe he had some changes to the car in Mexico that Gasly got at Circuit of the Americas. So I think the Alpine, and at least in Ocon's case, is in a much more competitive car and has again seen price increases that I just wouldn't be expecting from him. He's on a streak of 4 $0.5 million increases in a row. The last 4 races, Hulkenberg, exactly the same. So I think these experienced veteran drivers, one which is with Haas and one which is going into Haas next season, really liking the kind of consistency and reliability from these two on a track like Interlagos. So that's kind of where my head's at. I think Bottas is now the lowest price asset in the game. That Colapinto's gone up 0.5 million again. Bottas has gone down 0.1 million after Mexico. So Bottas, the budget enabler, but enabling price drops for him week in, week out. And then we'll quickly jump on to DRS boost options for the weekend. I think still Norris, and understandably so. He's extremely reliable in F1 fantasy terms. I'm really liking Leclerc if you're going for a build without Lando Norris. I'm very much considering a Sainz Leclerc double up. And we've talked about the chips. I've got them highlighted on the screen, those risk mitigation chips for this weekend. Even a wild card wouldn't be against the idea of that. But if you've got 3X or Limitless this weekend, I'd probably be saving for Qatar. Unless, of course, if you've got both, then I think you probably need to make a decision on which one is the best for you heading into the deadline. And in terms of how my team is stacking up for the weekend, I've got this team, as I said at the start of the video, for the 5th week in a row. I definitely think I'll be making a couple of changes this weekend. I'm very confident Ferrari, again, can continue this good form. And the lineup that immediately jumps out to me would be to bring in Charles Leclerc and potentially one of the RB drivers, or even Pierre Gasly. My first thought is Liam Lawson, and I really liked what I saw from him, even though he did finish close to last. In Mexico, he was able to scrap with Sergio Perez. I was really impressed by that. He's just really looked like a promising talent, and I really think even though he had a race below his averages at 3% ownership, I am very inclined to go for him as a differential. I also think the triple Ferrari lineup, although we did see quite a few people run it in Mexico, another differential lineup. So I'm really liking this. But if you can get this kind of lineup, even Norris Leclerc, I really like the look of. And, improved budget drivers, I think that's probably where I'd be leaning if you've got much more competitive budget than I do. The other lineup I'm thinking about, again, a little bit left field, but George Russell for me will never leave the conversation given he's a B-tier driver. Yes, Mercedes, I know, are not as competitive as the likes of Ferrari and McLaren at the moment. But George, when we look past his recent DNF history, I mean, you've got to go back to his disqualification in Spa, but as I suppose a DNF or not classified drive, but 20, 38, 19, 26, 21. I'm really liking this consistency. It's not nearly as explosive as the Ferraris. I acknowledge that. But again, a B-tier asset, which means then enabling another upgrade to another driver in my team from Valtteri Bottas to, I think we could squeeze in Alex Albon for just about that amount. I also am very much a fan of. So that would, for me, be 3 trades: Leclerc, Russell, Lawson in, and Norris, Sainz, and Bottas out. I'm not saying on paper that's more competitive, but I do think the reliable, more experienced midfield drivers in Albon, for example, could certainly hold me in good stead. Now, I suppose the reason why I'm looking at those midfield drivers is because of the fact those $0.5 million increases do set my team up nicely for price gains, certainly more so than the Zhou and the Bottas. And Zhou has pretty much screwed my strategy by going up 0.5 million 3 out of the last 5 races. We'll just quickly go over to this one more time. 3 out of the last 4, I should say. I carry Zhou all the way pretty much between Spain and Monza. Wildcarded him out in Monza, and then he's gone on a run of 3 $0.5 million increases in the last 4 weeks. So I'm pretty seething about that because he's a P20 merchant and has offered absolutely nothing but price drops and negative scores up until his good run of form from Azerbaijan. Maybe that's a reason to bring him back in. He is 8.2, which again still isn't really value for money in my eyes. But I could almost get to my desired 3x lineup of triple McLaren and backmarkers. I'm only 0.1 million short of Oscar Piastri. That would be my preference. Otherwise, Charles Leclerc, which is 0.3 million adrift at the moment. I think between now and Qatar, I could certainly cover that ground with the likes of Carlos Sainz in there. And if Ferrari continue to have banging drives, I think that hopefully will mean I'll be able to squeeze a bit of juice out of more reliable midfield drivers like Lawson, as we talked about. But I am getting close to setting my team up for a Qatar 3X, and hopefully the desired drivers. I mean, Sainz is great too, but my preference would be Piastri. So that's kind of where my head's at for now. I will be back with a deadline stream with the fantasy formula later this week. So please keep an eye on all of the news around that for when that is happening 1 hour before the sprint race, because the deadline is on the Saturday with the sprint race, the first session of the day, with qualifying later in the afternoon. So drop by for that. But you can find me on Twitter for any other questions you do have. Be sure to check me out there for all of my updates on the game. But in the meantime, guys, enjoy the rest of your week. Good luck with your teams this weekend, and I will see you all very soon.